being here. I would also like to thank Chief Justice, the Attorney General, members of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, legislative leadership, Representative Emily Kane, and the victims and families of domestic abuse who are with us today. These groups and individuals were instrumental in helping the administration prepare this domestic violence-related legislation we are announcing today. As the Commissioner of Public Safety, I am sad to say that domestic violence is something that we, as law enforcement, deal with on a far too regular basis. Historically, 50% of the homicides in Maine are a result of some type of domestic violence. These are our neighbors, our families, and our community. Domestic violence affects us all. It is time we stand together as Mainers to raise awareness and eradicate domestic abuse. I would like to thank all of the legislators who are standing behind me who have pledged their support to end domestic violence in Maine. I would also like to extend a special thanks to you and to Governor LePage, who made it a primary focus of his administration to work toward ending domestic violence in Maine. With that, I am extremely pleased and happy to turn the podium over to the Governor. Governor.
Thank you, Commissioner Morris. I would also like to recognize a few people and thank them for joining me here today. Chief Justice Softly, Attorney General Bill Snyder, District Attorneys, legislative leaders, legislators and senators, House Democrat Leader Emily Kane, Representative Conf, and of course Julia Colpitz, who has been very, very helpful in this whole process, and Ajadi from the Maine chapter of Murdered Children and Women Care of Dover Foxcroft. I really believe the best income is achieved when politics is put aside and we work together on common causes. Today we are putting people first, working on a very serious issue in our state, and we are putting partisan politics aside. The passage of domestic violence-related legislation will have a profound impact in the future of our state and the lives of victims. Domestic violence is not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not independent. It's a social problem that we need to address today. We hear stories on the news and then we go on our busy lives, but we ignore that the problem still exists. We've heard many stories, and it's because of my past that I am particularly passionate about this problem. It's important for me as a man to say enough is enough. I knew domestic violence when I was young, and I still know this abusive behavior is hurting many Mainers today. It is our responsibility to teach our young people that this type of violence is unacceptable behavior. Men have a critical role to play in ending domestic violence. It is not simply a woman's issue. Domestic abuse is a man's issue. The statistics don't lie. Studies show women are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse. 1 in 4 women have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. 81% of women experience violence by an intimate partner, spouse, or boyfriend in their lives. It has a terrible effect on women and children, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Our actions today with the introduction and eventually passage of this domestic violence legislation will have a profound impact on victims. And already we've had, in just a short period that we've been bringing this up, we've had a real good impact on what's happening here in Maine. And I want to personally thank the students at South Portland High School, University of Maine, Orono, male athletes, the Maine National Guard and the reserves for taking a stand against domestic violence and helping us eradicate this serious problem here in Maine. The proposed laws, first I would like to recognize the fact that Representative Emily King is sponsoring a bill involving risk assessment, which has already been released to the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee. I proudly support that legislation. I also want to recognize Representative King for sponsoring legislation that we've put forth. Thank you. Also, Representative Kenneth Fredette. He's also sponsoring one of our pieces of legislation, and I want to thank him for stepping up. We have two separate pieces of legislation that are being introduced today and presented to the legislature. Additionally, I will be issuing an executive order, which I will explain more in a minute. First bill, bail code. The first proposed law seeks to amend the Maine bail code in order to protect victims of domestic violence. The law makes a number of changes, including stating bail must be determined by a judge, not a bail commissioner, in cases of crimes involving domestic violence in which an aggravated assault, sexual assault, violation of a protective order, or strangulations of another person have been charged by law enforcement. I think this is very, very critical. There needs to be a cooling off time, and we can't just allow victims to be attacked and then 2 hours later have that person back on the street. I think there needs to be time so that person, the offender, can cool down a little bit. Victims' Compensation Fund. This bill proposed will ensure funding for the Victims' Compensation Fund. When an offender is sentenced or a fine is imposed, the court requires the offender to pay a $25 fee. The Victim Compensation Fund program provides financial reimbursement for losses suffered by victims of violent crime and their families. What is happening in some cases is the fee is being suspended by the judges. This law will prohibit courts from waiving that fee. We believe there has to be a price paid, and you have to realize that you just can't go around beating up people. And if you don't have the money, you're gonna have to find it. It's that simple. The executive order. The final piece of our domestic violence agenda involves an executive order which will allow the creation of a task force to develop electronic assistance to provide safety for domestic violence abuse victims. For example, this group is encouraged to learn more about technological tools for tracking the movement of domestic violence offenders after they are released from custody or bail or probation. The task force will also explore electronic assistance to be utilized by victims, such as life alert bracelets. I will ask members of the Department of Public Safety, Office of Information and Technology, Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, Maine Chiefs of Police, Department of Corrections, the Attorney General's Office to participate on this task force. And right now, I will even sign it. So that you all realize how serious we are about eliminating this problem. In conclusion, ending domestic violence by passing a few laws and an executive order isn't going to eliminate this problem. It will only be eliminated when the men in this room and the men throughout our state speak out, step up about this problem, and make it socially unacceptable behavior. And I ask you all to join me in doing that. Thank you.
Before we move on, I would once again like to thank both Representative Ken Fredette and House Democrat Leader Emily Kane for sponsoring the two pieces of domestic violence legislation that the governor has introduced. Representative Kane has shown her dedication of working with the governor to end domestic violence in this great state of ours. On top of introducing her own legislation dealing with risk assessment, Representative Emily Kane has agreed to sponsor the governor's bill dealing with bail code. I am pleased and delighted to introduce House Democratic Leader Emily Kane.
Commissioner Morris, thank you, Governor LePage, thank you to my colleagues behind me, and thank you to Julia Colpitz and all of those working to end domestic violence in Maine every single day. As many of you know, the Governor and I don't always agree on everything, but we do stand united in a zero-tolerance policy for domestic violence. And I'm pleased to sponsor the legislation being announced today. Here in Maine, we live in one of the safest states in our nation. Most of us have no fear of walking down the street, and many folks leave their houses and cars unlocked. The risk of being mugged, having your car stolen, or your home broken is low. Unfortunately, while most of us feel secure, there are far too many of our citizens who do live in fear, not of a random break-in or attack, but rather in fear of those who are closest to them, often under the same roof. While Maine has one of the lowest murder rates in the nation, year after year, over half of those murders are directly related to domestic violence. The scourge of domestic violence is far too common in our great state. Only a few days ago, a woman in Bath was nearly stabbed to death by her live-in boyfriend. Her only saving grace was that his knife blade broke before he could issue the final blow. It is unacceptable that this is happening here in our state. Last year, the murders in Dexter rocked communities across Maine. It was a wake-up call. Women and children should not live in fear in their own homes. Democrats and Republicans must work together to stem the tide against domestic violence. Sadly, there is no miracle cure for domestic violence in Maine. The legislation we are introducing today is an important step to accomplishing the goal of ending domestic violence. The bills today are a starting point for the great work that lies ahead. It is simply not enough to increase punishment for this kind of crime. We must also work together on comprehensive domestic violence prevention resources and treatment for battered women and their families. And it's my pleasure to be with you all today, and it is even more my pleasure to introduce Julie Colpitz from the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. Julie and the Coalition have worked tirelessly to support the victims of domestic violence in our state. They have done a great service to the families that are suffering in Maine and continue to do that great work today. Thank you, Julie.
We know that all domestic abuse and violence does not carry the same risk for murder and serious reoffense. We also know that programs around the country are effectively reducing both the number of homicides and the rate of reoffense. High-quality risk assessment information is one critical success factor in all of those successful programs. We also know that accurate, timely information improves decision-making, whether it's in our own lives or whether it's in the arena of domestic violence. Even if nothing else should change in our system, having better information at the right time will improve decision-making and responses. When high-risk situations are identified, there are things we can do, ways to use our existing scarce resources more effectively. We do not need to feel hopeless. While there's no perfect cure or one thing that will end domestic violence, there are important incremental improvements that change outcomes substantially for the better, that literally save lives. With the introduction of Governor LePage's bill, you have the last piece of an integrated set of options for your consideration. You have recommendations for timely, consistent notification of victims, recommendations for improved risk assessment, for better management of strangulation, for changes in bail process, all of them working as an integrated network to be able to have an appropriate high-level response to high-risk situations. We also now have a heightened awareness of particularly serious stalking behaviors and an evolving plan for developing a pilot project on electronic monitoring. And that is because of the committed and hard work of an integrated network of people whose work has all brought this to fruition in this session of the legislature. So thank you to Governor Page for his leadership. Thank all of the legislators and others for their time and their energy that they bring to considering and hopefully moving forward to take action on all these issues. Thank you.
Today, the governor has made it very clear that his administration is dedicated to ending the blight of domestic violence in Maine. With that, thank you very much for coming. We look forward to your participation and help, and I would welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you. Seeing no questions, lunch.
Quick question for the governor, if that's possible. Yeah. Good afternoon, Governor. Just a quick question on domestic violence programs. I understand, that we're making it center stage here for this administration, but in your recent budget proposal, we've also included millions of dollars of cuts to programs that support victims of domestic violence. If there's a way to bring that back in the form of an amendment during the budget process, and it was done in a reasonable way, would you consider reinstating those monies?
Absolutely. I will say it again, and I've said it many times. Many of the cuts that are being proposed are not because I want to cut programs. It's because in April, I will be running out of cash. There's a difference between wanting to cut and being forced to balance the budget and have the money to do so. If you all have a little extra in your pockets, leave it and we can extend it a little longer. Anyone else?
Governor, just on a different subject, could you just comment on Major Libby retiring?
Yes, Major Libby has announced his retirement. I think he's retired for the right reason, I might say. He wants to spend time with his family and with his wife. And it's a great loss for me. He's been an absolute phenomenal adjutant general, as he's just a phenomenal human being. So I'm sorry to see him go, and he's going to be hard to replace. Anyone else?